We all like to think that we are good, incapable of cruel or inhumane acts. But what if the right, or perhaps the wrong circumstances could awaken something in you that you never knew existed? Something dark, something monstrous. The truth is that the line between good and evil is not as clear as we would like to believe, and that line, as thin as it may seem, is closer to us than we admit. We live in a world where difficult decisions, extreme circumstances, and powerful influences can transform even the best intentions into actions we would never dare to imagine. Today, we are going to explore this uncomfortable but essential reality. We're going to dive into the depths of human nature, discover what drives us to cross this line, and, most importantly, learn what we can do to resist it. Have you ever considered how your morality, the compass that guides your actions, can be as malleable as a leaf in the wind? What defines us as good or bad is not as solid as we like to believe. Our morality, often seen as a stronghold, can crumble in seconds under the right or wrong conditions. Why is it that an ordinary person can suddenly adopt behaviors that defy everything they thought they were? Philip Zimbardo, a renowned psychologist, describes this moral fragility as a kind of situational metamorphosis. He argues that we are not static creatures. We are shaped by context, by environmental pressures, and, most importantly, by the narratives we construct to justify our actions. To illustrate, consider the case of Ivan Frederick, an American soldier who, prior to his experience at the infamous Abu Ghraib prison, was just one of us. An ordinary man with strong principles who loved his family and believed he was serving his country with honor. Yet, placed in an environment of normalized abuse, constant dehumanization, and a lack of moral oversight, he became an agent of unimaginable cruelty. Was he inherently evil, or did his environment shape him? Context has the power to create a disconnect between who we are and how we act in extreme situations. It's as if our morality is written in sand, not stone. A famous experiment helps to explain this: the simulated torture test known as the Stanford Prison Experiment. Over the course of a few days, normal, psychologically healthy students took on the roles of guards and prisoners in a simulation that quickly turned into a nightmare. The guards, protected by uniforms that gave them authority, began to humiliate and abuse the prisoners. What led ordinary people to cross this line? And if you were in their shoes, would you act differently? But this fragility is not reserved for extreme experiences. Small, everyday decisions show how context can influence us without us even realizing it. Have you ever taken an item that wasn't yours, justifying it with, "It's no big deal"? Or perhaps laughed at a cruel joke simply because everyone around you laughed too? Small actions like these are stumbling blocks on the path that leads to that moral abyss we talk about so much. This raises an important question. To what extent do our actions reflect who we really are? And to what extent are they simply a product of the environment in which we find ourselves? Context not only influences, but transforms us. So how can we resist this invisible but powerful force? Can we prepare ourselves to not succumb to circumstances, or are we doomed to go with the flow? Why do we obey? This is a simple question, but the answer may reveal one of the most disturbing aspects of human nature. From an early age, we are taught to respect and follow authority figures, parents, teachers, leaders. Disobedience is often the foundation of social order, but what happens when the authority we follow demands something that goes against our own values? To what extent are we willing to sacrifice what we believe is right, just to avoid confrontation or to please a figure in power? The experiment of Milgram, a landmark in psychology, offers a disturbing answer. Imagine yourself in a room, instructed by a man in a white lab coat to administer electric shocks to another person every time they get an answer wrong. As the experiment progresses, the shocks increase in intensity, eventually reaching a lethal level. The person on the other end screams in pain, begging you to stop, but the authority figure next to you insists, "Keep going." It's essential to the experiment. About 65% of the participants complied to the end, administering the maximum shock, even against their better judgment. Why? Because a man with a title and a uniform asked them to. What is so powerful about authority that makes us act against our own instincts? The answer lies in how we view figures of power. When someone is invested with authority, we tend to see them as having superior knowledge or moral responsibility. We come to believe that our actions, even the most questionable ones, are justified by this transfer of responsibility. After all, if something goes wrong, it won't be our fault. It will be the fault of the person who gave the order. This creates a dangerous disconnect between our actions and their consequences. But this blind obedience is not restricted to controlled experiments. It permeates our history, from Nazi soldiers who claimed they were just following orders, to tragedies like the massacre of Jonestown, where hundreds of people followed the orders of a charismatic leader to take their own lives. In each case, what was at stake was not people's intrinsic evil, but their inability to question an authority perceived as legitimate. Now ask yourself, how many times have you followed an order without thinking, simply because it came from someone above you? Maybe it was something simple, like an instruction at work. But what if it was something more serious? What if you were pressured to do something you thought was wrong but felt you couldn't refuse? Would you have the courage to defy authority, or would you give in to the comfort of obedience? Obedience to authority is a powerful force, but it is not invincible. We can learn to recognize it, question it, and, when necessary, resist it. This requires courage and, above all, responsibility, the recognition that, in the end, we are always responsible for our actions, regardless of who ordered them. And here's the problem. This blind obedience is even more dangerous when combined with another disturbing phenomenon. Dehumanization occurs because, when we stop seeing each other as human, obeying cruel orders becomes much easier. Let's explore this dark side further. How do you convince someone to treat another person cruelly? The answer lies not just in orders or context, but in something even deeper: dehumanization. This process, as old as humanity itself, is the key to transforming the other into something less than human, into something unworthy of compassion. When we begin to see others as objects, threats, or mere numbers, acts that would have been unthinkable before become justifiable. Dehumanization is a clever, almost imperceptible psychological trap. It starts with language, labels that reduce the complexity of a human being to a single negative characteristic. Throughout history, we've seen this time and again. In Nazi concentration camps, Jews were called rats. During the Rwandan genocide, Tutsis were described as cockroaches. These words didn't just describe, they reshaped reality, making it easier for people to turn a blind eye, or worse, to participate in the atrocities that followed. And this isn't confined to major historical events. Dehumanization happens every day on a micro scale. Think about how people refer to certain groups in society: lazy, thugs, parasites. These labels create emotional distance and a moral gulf that allows us to ignore or justify their suffering. Have you ever caught yourself using or accepting these labels without question? What if such labels were used against you? Albert Bandura, one of the great names in psychology, carried out a simple but revealing experiment. He asked students to apply punishments to another group. Before they began, some heard dehumanizing descriptions of the target group, such as being called animals. The result was clear. Those who heard the labels applied significantly harsher punishments. A simple label was enough to erode empathy and justify cruelty. Now think about online interactions. Anonymity and distance make people say things they would never say face to face. The person on the other side of the screen is not perceived as a full human being. They're just an avatar, a profile. This digital dehumanization creates the perfect breeding ground for bullying, harassment, and hate speech. Have you ever been part of this cycle, perhaps without realizing it? What could have prevented it? Dehumanization is dangerous because it is insidious. It doesn't require us to hate someone, only to fail to see their humanity. But there is a way to combat it, to bring to light what has been hidden. We must remember that each person is more than a label, that there is a story, a complexity, a life. Empathy is the most powerful weapon against dehumanization, but it requires effort. It demands that you look beyond appearances and hear what lies behind the words. However, there is another element that amplifies the impact of dehumanization: the loss of personal responsibility. When we believe our actions have no consequences or that we are protected by anonymity, evil can flourish. Have you ever wondered how some people can commit unthinkable acts without feeling guilty? The answer often lies in the loss of personal responsibility, a psychological phenomenon that dissolves the link between our actions and their consequences. When we believe that we will not be held accountable for what we do, something dangerous happens. Our morality, normally a solid guide, begins to disintegrate. This concept manifests itself in alarming ways in situations of anonymity or in groups where responsibility is diluted. A classic example is the behavior of crowds. Under the guise of a group, individuals who alone would never break a window or loot a store suddenly participate in acts of vandalism. It is not that these people are intrinsically bad, but the feeling that no one will know it was me creates a space where empathy and blame are easily dismissed. Philip Zimbardo stressed this with a simple but revealing experiment. He left an abandoned car in 2 different locations: the Bronx, a high-crime neighborhood at the time, and Palo Alto, an upper-middle-class, more cohesive area. In the Bronx, the car was vandalized within hours, while in Palo Alto it remained untouched. The difference? In the Bronx, anonymity was guaranteed. In Palo Alto, the possibility of being recognized inhibited destructive behavior. The lesson is clear. When we believe our actions will not be tracked, we allow ourselves to do things we would never do under the watchful eyes of a community. This same logic applies to the digital world. Behind a screen, protected by avatars and pseudonyms, people often say and do things that would be unimaginable in the real world. It's a phenomenon known as online disinhibition. A cruel comment, a threat, or a lie becomes easy to justify because it doesn't feel real. But the consequences are real for those on the other end. Have you ever stopped to think about the impact of your words when no one seems to be watching? In addition to anonymity, another factor contributes to the loss of accountability: the diffusion of blame. In hierarchical systems or large groups, it is common to think, "I only did my part. Everyone is responsible but me." This happened in situations like the Abu Ghraib abuse scandal, where soldiers justified their actions by saying they were just following orders. This also happens in large corporations, where questionable decisions are made by groups, diluting responsibility among members. When no one is entirely to blame, everyone becomes an accomplice. But is there a way to resist this phenomenon? The answer lies in actively being aware of our actions, even when it seems like no one is watching. Taking responsibility is an act of courage that requires questioning not only the orders we receive, but also the narratives we use to justify our choices. Language is a powerful tool for perpetuating the loss of responsibility and justifying morally questionable acts. When words are manipulated to mask reality, they transform the unacceptable into something palatable. What keeps us from falling into the abyss of cruelty when everything around us seems to push us there? The answer lies in conscious choices. Resisting evil is not a matter of luck or talent. It is a skill we cultivate daily, moment by moment, through small actions that affirm our humanity and responsibility. Making conscious choices is an act of courage because it often means going against the grain. Think about the participants in the Milgram experiment who refused to continue applying shocks. They were not stronger or wiser than others, but they chose to listen to their consciences when all external signs told them to obey. These people chose to take responsibility, even under pressure, showing that true heroism lies not in the absence of fear, but in the willingness to face it. This conscious choice also manifests itself in everyday situations. How many times have you seen something wrong and decided not to act because it was easier to remain silent? Maybe it was an injustice at work, a cruel comment in a conversation, or even something as simple as returning extra change that was mistakenly given to you. Each of these situations is a test, an opportunity to assert your morality in a world that often encourages us to neglect it. The psychologist Philip Zimbardo emphasizes that heroism is not an act reserved for great figures or extraordinary moments. On the contrary, he believes that heroism is within the reach of everyone who decides to act when no one else will. Wesley Autry, known as the subway hero, is proof of this. He saw a man fall onto the subway tracks during a seizure and, without hesitation, jumped in to save him, shielding him with his own body as the train passed by. Wesley didn't plan to be a hero. He simply chose to act at the right time. But this choice is not easy and often requires going against group norms, standing up to authority figures, or enduring criticism. So how can we prepare ourselves to make these choices when the time comes? The answer lies in vigilance. We need to cultivate constant awareness of our actions and their consequences. This means questioning comfortable narratives, challenging unfair orders, and above all, remembering that every decision, no matter how small, contributes to who we are. Conscious choice also depends on something fundamental, the ability to see others as human, with all their complexities and vulnerabilities. Without this connection, our choices become cold, guided only by convenience or fear. Seeing others in their humanity reminds us that, ultimately, we are all sharing the same journey, and that changes everything. Have you ever wondered why seemingly good people sometimes do unthinkable things? We like to believe that the line between good and evil is clear. People are either one or the other. But the truth is much darker and more complicated. All of us carry within us the potential for good and for evil. It's part of being human. Most of the time, our better side wins. We help each other, show kindness, and live by a moral code. But under the right or wrong circumstances, the good in people can disappear, and a darker side can take over. What causes this? What makes a loving person turn cruel or a peaceful soul become violent? The answer lies deep in human psychology and in the way our environment shapes us. Let's start with pressure. People are social beings, and we're heavily influenced by the groups we belong to. Peer pressure, authority, or even fear of rejection can lead us to act in ways we never thought possible. Think of historical events, like Nazi Germany, where ordinary citizens were swept up in acts of unimaginable cruelty. Many of them were not evil people to begin with. They were just following orders, conforming to group behavior, or trying to protect themselves. Another powerful force is fear. When people feel threatened, their survival instincts kick in. This instinct can make us lash out, hurt others, or betray our values to save ourselves. In moments of fear, it's easy to forget compassion and focus only on survival. Then there's power. Power changes people. Studies show that when people gain power, they can become more selfish and less empathetic. They may stop seeing others as equals and start treating them as tools to achieve their own goals. This is why corruption is so common. It's not that all leaders are bad people, but power itself can bring out their darker instincts. Anger and resentment are also triggers. When people feel wronged or overlooked, it can fester into bitterness. This bitterness can push someone to take revenge or act in ways that hurt others, even if they once had a kind heart. And let's not forget how easily people can justify their actions. When someone does something bad, they often convince themselves it was the right thing to do. Maybe they believe it was for the greater good, or maybe they blame the victim, saying they deserved it. This kind of thinking helps them avoid guilt and keeps them from facing the reality of what they've done. But it's not just individual factors. Sometimes, entire systems and societies encourage cruelty. When governments, institutions, or cultural norms promote violence, discrimination, or oppression, even good people can become part of the problem. They stop questioning what's right and wrong and simply go along with what everyone else is doing. So, what can we learn from all this? The scary truth is that anyone, yes, even you and me, can